There is a moment in every redemption story where the people closest to the person finally speak. And when Michael English's daughter decided to talk about her father, what she said stopped people cold. Not because the gospel community didn't know about his struggles, they did, but hearing it through her voice, filtered through years of watching her father fight his way back, carried a weight that no interview, no concert testimony, no homecoming stage moment ever quite captured. By the time you reach the 10-minute mark of this video, you will understand exactly why this family carried their silence for so long, and why breaking it now matters more than anything Michael has said in his own words. Michael English stands as one of the most gifted vocalists the Southern gospel and contemporary Christian music world has ever produced. His voice, a tenor instrument of uncommon beauty and control, drew Bill Gaither's attention in the late 1980s when Michael was still a young man from Henderson, North Carolina, finding his footing in a crowded field of gospel singers. What Gaither recognized wasn't just technical ability. It was the kind of voice that could make a congregation of strangers feel like they were hearing a promise made directly to them. For millions of fans who grew up watching the Gaither Homecoming videos, Michael wasn't just a performer on a stage. He was part of the soundtrack of their faith, the voice they turned to when they needed to believe something difficult. His years with the Gaither Vocal Band in the early 1990s put him at the center of one of gospel music's great creative runs. Albums like Reunited and the early Homecoming recordings placed Michael alongside legends Bill and Gloria Gaither, Mark Lowry, Larnell Harris, and the chemistry those sessions produced became the foundation of what an entire generation understands gospel music to sound like. When Michael stepped forward to sing, the room changed. That's not sentiment. That's what the recordings prove, even now, decades later. And then life intervened, the way it sometimes does, quietly at first, and then all at once. By 1994, Michael's personal life had fractured in ways that were impossible to conceal. A Dove award-winning year gave way to public scandal, and the Christian music industry, an industry that prizes moral testimony as much as musical talent, found itself caught between its love for his gifts and the reality of what had happened. Michael stepped away. The Grammy recognition, the label support, the homecoming stage, all of it went quiet. For fans who had watched him sing In Christ Alone and Healing with such apparent conviction, the silence was genuinely painful. What many of those fans didn't see was what happened inside his family during those years. And that's the part of this story that gospel media has spent 30 years largely stepping around. Because the struggles didn't end with the public scandal of 1994. Prescription drug addiction entered Michael's life in the years that followed, pulling him through cycles of recovery and relapse that no press release and no carefully worded statement could fully convey. The man who had stood on the homecoming stage and brought audiences to tears was, in the years away from that stage, fighting something that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with survival. His family watched it. His daughter grew up inside it. And when she decided to speak, she wasn't offering a polished narrative. She was describing what it actually looked like from the inside. Stay with this story because what comes next, what she said about the moment she realized her father was truly fighting back, is the part that changes how you understand every comeback Michael English has made since 2000. The road back into gospel music was not a single event. Michael's return was gradual, incomplete at times, marked by false starts and honest setbacks that the faith community received with varying degrees of grace. His recording work in the early 2000s showed the voice was still there, perhaps more textured now, carrying something earned that the younger voice hadn't needed to carry. Bill Gaither's decision to keep the door open, to continue including Michael in homecoming events even as questions lingered, said something about both men. Gaither has spoken publicly about believing in the theology of second chances, and his relationship with Michael over the years was a living example of what that theology costs and what it produces. Michael's daughter watched all of this. She watched her father rebuild credibility on stages where he had once stood at his peak. She watched audiences who had every reason to withhold their trust choose instead to stand and sing along. And she carried her own story through all of it, a daughter's story, which is different in every way from the father's story, because the daughter doesn't get to choose when the crisis begins or when it ends. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in his circle expected to become public. When she spoke, she talked about addiction the way someone talks about it when they've lived adjacent to it for years, not with clinical distance, not with the careful language of a rehearsed statement, but with the specific details that only proximity produces. She described what it was like to watch her father want recovery and struggle to hold it. She described the faith dimension of it, the way Michael returned again and again to the gospel not as a performance, but as a lifeline, and how confusing that could be for a child who understood the songs, but was still learning what faith does when it's tested past the point of comfort. What she confirmed, and this is what stunned the people who heard her, was that Michael had spoken to her honestly about those years, not protectively, not with the versions adults sometimes construct to shield their children. He told her the truth about what addiction had done to him, what it had taken, what it had cost the people around him. And her response to that honesty, delivered in her own words, was not what most people expected. She said it made her respect him more. Not because the failures were acceptable, not because the struggle was anything other than real and costly, but because a man who had spent years performing faith for audiences of thousands had chosen, with his own daughter, to simply be honest. And in the world of gospel music, where testimony is currency and image carries enormous weight, that kind of private honesty is rarer than the stages suggest. The gospel community's response, when word of her comments began to circulate, reflected exactly the tension that has always surrounded Michael's story. There were those who had prayed for him through the difficult years and received the news with something close to relief, confirmation that the redemption arc so many had hoped for was not a performance. There were others who wrestled with the complexity of it, with what it means to hold together a man's extraordinary gifts and his genuine failures without collapsing either into the other. And there were fans, ordinary fans, who had watched the homecoming videos in their living rooms on Sunday afternoons, who simply wept. Because what she described was something they recognized from their own families and their own faith journeys. What Michael has said publicly about his past, in interviews and on stage, and in the liner notes of albums that tried to tell parts of the story, has always carried the quality of hard-won honesty. The 2009 recording work, the later collaborations with the Gaither family of artists, the appearances at homecoming events where he stood beside people like Guy Penrod and David Phelps and Wes Hampton, all of it was a public record of a man choosing, again and again, to return to the thing he loved and the faith that had not released him even when he had struggled to hold on to it. His daughter's words put a frame around all of it that the public record alone couldn't provide. For those of us who have followed Michael's journey through the years, through the early Gaither Vocal Band recordings, through the silence, through the tentative returns and the full-throated comebacks, what she shared is something we've perhaps understood on some level without having language for it. Gospel music has always been music about the distance between where we are and where we hope to be. Michael English's voice has been, for decades, one of the instruments that music plays on, and his daughter's willingness to describe what that journey cost and what it produced adds a dimension to the story that no amount of stage testimony could replicate. Because testimony from a stage is a singular event, shaped and chosen and offered to an audience. What a daughter says about her father is something else entirely. It's biography. It's the record that survives the performance. What this tells us about faith, about family, and about the kind of perseverance that doesn't look triumphant in the middle of it, is something this audience already understands instinctively. You don't follow gospel music for 30 years without watching people you love face things that don't resolve cleanly. You know what it looks like when faith isn't a comfort, but a contest. And when Michael's daughter described her father choosing honesty over image in the private relationship that mattered most to him, she was describing something this community has quietly valued all along, without always having someone willing to say it plainly. If you've been a fan of Michael's since the early Homecoming days, you know exactly what it means to hear a voice that sounds like it's carrying something real. And you know the difference between a singer performing conviction and a man singing because he has no choice but to. Her words help explain why that difference has always been audible in Michael's work, even in the years when the circumstances around him were complicated. There's one more part of this story that most people haven't connected yet, and it involves the relationship between Michael English and Bill Gaither, in a way that adds context to everything his daughter said. Gaither's loyalty to Michael through the difficult years was not a simple thing. It created friction in some corners of the Christian music world, where the expectations placed on gospel artists are high, and the tolerance for public failure has historically been uneven. Gaither's position, articulated in interviews over the years and visible in the Homecoming recordings themselves, was that the music had always been bigger than the musicians who made it, and that redemption, if it meant anything at all within the Christian faith, had to mean something for real people with real failures, and not just for the idealized figures on album covers. That position cost Gaither something in certain circles. It also produced over time some of the most emotionally resonant moments in the Homecoming catalog, moments where Michael's voice and the stories behind it converged in performances that audiences recognized as something beyond entertainment. Mark Lowry, who has spoken with characteristic directness about the relationships inside the Gaither family of artists, has said that what holds that community together isn't shared perfection, but shared purpose, and that Michael's continued presence in that community is an example of what shared purpose actually requires of people. Lynda, Randle, whose own ministry within the Homecoming world has centered on the themes of healing and perseverance, has reflected publicly on what it means to stand beside artists who carry complicated histories and choose, together, to make music that points beyond those histories. Michael English's story, in her framing, is not an exception to the gospel Homecoming message. It is one of its clearest illustrations. What happens next for Michael and his family is something the gospel community will be watching, the way this community has always watched, with investment, with prayer, and with the particular patience of people who understand that the most important chapters of a life don't always announce themselves in advance. His daughter has spoken. The record now includes her voice alongside his, and that changes the texture of the story in ways that will take time to fully absorb. The question she left open, the one that nobody who heard her can quite set aside, is what it means for a child to grow up watching a parent fight something that enormous and come through it choosing honesty over image. What does that inheritance look like over a lifetime? What does it produce in the next generation? Those are questions gospel music has always asked in its songs, and now they belong to this family's actual history. Whatever comes next, fans who have followed this ministry for decades know one thing: Michael English's story isn't finished, and neither is the conversation his daughter has now made impossible to avoid. If this story moved you, the next video will as well. We've been covering the broader Gaither Homecoming legacy, and what has come out of those conversations is just as unexpected, just as honest, and just as worth your time.